The moment you stopped needing them, that was the moment you became dangerous to them. Not dangerous in the way people warn you about, dangerous in the way that rewires someone's nervous system. Dangerous in the way that turns a person who once looked through you into someone who cannot stop thinking about you at 2 in the morning, replaying conversations, suddenly aware of an absence that feels like a missing organ. Most people spend years trying to decode the avoidant. They read the articles, they memorize the attachment theory, they craft the perfect message. They give space, then they close the space, then they give it again, like they are adjusting a thermostat in a house that was never built to hold warmth, and none of it works, because they have been asking the wrong question from the beginning. The question is never, how do I make an avoidant want me? The question, the one that changes everything, is this: what does an avoidant actually experience when they encounter someone whose ego does not need them? That answer is not what psychology textbooks will tell you. It is not what relationship coaches package into 5 steps. What that answer reveals about human nature, about fear, about identity, about the terrifying power of genuine self-possession, that is what this is about. The avoidant person is not running from you. That is the first lie most people accept without examination, and it costs them everything. What the avoidant is running from is a feeling. A specific, ancient, deeply wired feeling that gets activated the moment another human being gets close enough to matter. The feeling is not, this person is too much. The feeling is closer to this: if this person sees who I actually am, I will not survive what happens next. That distinction seems small on the surface. Underneath it, that distinction is the entire psychological universe separating connection from collapse. What most people do when they sense an avoidant pulling away is they move toward them. They explain themselves, they soften their edges, they make themselves smaller, quieter, less demanding, as though the solution to someone fearing intimacy is to become less of a person so there is less intimacy to fear. This is not love. This behavior is a sophisticated form of self-erasure dressed in the language of patience, and the avoidance nervous system reads it the way a predator reads stillness and prey, not with attraction, with confirmation, with the quiet, unconscious signal that says, I was right. This person needs me more than they need themselves, and that realization, though they could never articulate it, makes the avoidant feel profoundly, suffocatingly trapped. Rarely does anyone discuss what an avoidance ego actually is built from. People talk about avoidant behavior, the withdrawal, the emotional unavailability, the sudden coldness after warmth, but very few people go beneath the behavior to examine the architecture underneath. The avoidant ego is not large. That is the paradox that most people miss entirely. The avoidance ego is, in most cases, extraordinarily fragile, constructed not from genuine self-worth, but from the absence of needing anyone to confirm that worth. The avoidant does not feel powerful because they have mastered themselves. They feel temporarily powerful because they have mastered the art of not letting anyone get close enough to threaten them. There is a profound difference between those two things, and that difference is where everything important lives. Somewhere in early life, the avoidant learned a lesson that was never spoken aloud. The lesson was this: needing someone is a form of weakness that will be punished. Maybe the punishment came through emotional unavailability from a parent. Maybe it came through a love that was inconsistent, warm on Tuesday, cold on Thursday, with no logic the child could decode. Maybe it came through a relationship where vulnerability was met with ridicule or silence. The form does not matter as much as the conclusion the nervous system drew. Closeness is dangerous. Self-sufficiency is survival. And from that conclusion, an entire identity was constructed, an identity that looks from the outside like strength, but from the inside feels like standing alone in a very large, very quiet room and having learned to call that silence peace. The person who tries to love an avoidant by shrinking themselves is making a fundamental error in psychological judgment. They believe they are creating safety. They believe that by needing less, they are removing the threat. But the avoidant does not need the threat to be removed. The avoidant needs the entire framework that has kept them emotionally isolated to be, and this is the word that matters, challenged, not attacked, not exposed with cruelty, challenged. There is a particular kind of person who challenges an avoidant not by confronting their walls directly, but by simply having no need for those walls to come down. That kind of person is psychologically unsettling to the avoidant in a way that nothing else is. Because that person, the one who does not need the avoidant to open up, the one who is not waiting at the door, the one who has a life so genuinely full that the avoidant's absence creates only a mild inconvenience and not a catastrophe. That person makes the avoidant's entire defensive structure feel suddenly unnecessary. And when a defense mechanism feels unnecessary, the psyche does something unexpected. It starts to grieve the years spent hiding behind it. Most attachment content will tell you to give an avoidant space. That advice is not wrong, but it is dangerously incomplete. Space given from desperation looks completely different from space given from self-possession, and the avoidant nervous system, which is extraordinarily attuned to the emotional states of others, developed precisely because it had to monitor the emotional weather of unpredictable caregivers, can feel the difference immediately. Space given from desperation says, I am stepping back because I am hoping this tactic will pull you closer. Space given from genuine self-possession says, I have a life, I have value, I have direction, and whether you are in it or not does not alter the fundamental trajectory of who I am becoming. One of those spaces is a manipulation, the other is an identity. And the avoidant, who has spent a lifetime detecting manipulation beneath warmth, responds to that genuine identity with something they almost never feel in relationships, something close to awe. The ego of the avoidant, fragile as it is, operates on a very specific internal economy. In that economy, the avoidant sense of self-worth is maintained by the belief that they need no one and that anyone who needs them has by that act of needing revealed an inferiority. This is not a conscious belief. It is not something they would ever say, but it runs everything. It determines who they pursue, who they dismiss, how long they stay, and the exact emotional temperature at which they begin to withdraw. The moment someone enters their life who does not participate in that economy, who does not need their approval, who does not wilt at their emotional unavailability, who does not make the avoidance moods the weather of the relationship, that person breaks the entire system. And a broken system in psychology does not simply stop working. It searches, often frantically, for the missing input that used to keep it running. What happens inside the avoidant when their ego is genuinely threatened, not wounded through cruelty, but challenged through another person's complete psychological independence, is one of the most misunderstood dynamics in all of relationship psychology. The avoidant begins to feel something they are not supposed to feel toward someone they are not supposed to feel it toward. They begin to feel uncertain. And uncertainty, for a person who has organized their entire emotional life around the illusion of control, is not a mild discomfort. It is a psychological earthquake. Suddenly, the person they had quietly categorized as safe because they seemed to need the avoidant more than the avoidant needed them, no longer fits that category. And the mind, when a familiar category dissolves, does something automatic and ancient. It pays attention. It focuses. It tries to re-understand what it thought it already knew. Attention, for the avoidant, is not a small thing. Most people in the avoidance life have received their attention through need, through emotional crisis, through dramatic pursuit, through the kind of urgent reaching out that confirms the avoidant's unconscious belief that relationships are fundamentally exhausting. But the person who earns attention through self-possession earns it through an entirely different psychological door. That door does not open through need. It opens through mystery. And the avoidant, who has spent years believing they were the mysterious one, the one who could not be fully known, the one who kept their emotional cards permanently face down, suddenly finds themselves on the opposite side of that dynamic. Suddenly they are the one trying to read someone else. Suddenly they are the one wondering, And wondering for someone who has carefully eliminated uncertainty from their emotional life feels dangerously close to wanting. Wanting is precisely what the avoidant has spent years learning not to feel. This is the detail that most people in relationship with an avoidant completely fail to understand. The avoidant does not withhold wanting because they are cruel, or because they do not feel, or because something is fundamentally broken in them beyond repair. They withhold wanting because wanting, in their earliest emotional education, was the precursor to loss. They reached towards something and it was not there. They expressed a need and it was met with absence or inconsistency or a conditional warmth that evaporated without warning. And so the psyche, which is always trying to protect the organism from repeated pain, built a wall not around feeling. Feelings cannot be walled off entirely, but around the expression of feeling, around the acknowledgement of wanting. The avoidant still wants. They want deeply, in many cases more deeply than the people they are with, because suppressed wanting does not disappear, it accumulates. It sits in the body like pressure behind a sealed door, and the right person, the person who is not standing at that door begging it to open, is paradoxically the person most likely to make that door move. Understanding this changes the entire way a person should approach the question of what to do with an avoidant. The conventional wisdom says, be patient, be consistent, create safety. And while none of that is entirely wrong, it misses the deeper psychological mechanism that actually shifts the avoidant's internal experience. Safety, for the avoidant, is not primarily created through gentleness. Safety is created through credibility. And credibility in the avoidant's emotional world comes from one source: the demonstrated reality that you do not need them to be okay. Because the avoidant's deepest fear in any close relationship is that they will become responsible for another person's emotional survival. That fear is not selfishness, though it can look exactly like selfishness from the outside. That fear is the very reasonable terror of someone who once experienced what it meant to be a child responsible for managing an adult's emotional state, and who swore, on some level below conscious language, never to be trapped in that position again. The person who walks into the avoidant's life carrying their own emotional survival completely in their own hands does not trigger that fear. They dismantle it, not immediately, not dramatically, but in the quiet, consistent way that reality dismantles old beliefs through repeated exposure to evidence that contradicts the story the nervous system has been telling for years. Every time that person does not collapse when the avoidant withdraws, the avoidant's nervous system receives a data point it does not know what to do with. Every time that person continues building their own life, pursuing their own purpose, expanding their own identity without using the avoidant as the foundation, the avoidant psyche registers something unprecedented. It registers someone who is genuinely, not performatively, free. And freedom, to a person who has only ever experienced connection as a form of captivity, is the single most attractive force in the psychological universe. Psychological freedom is not the same as emotional unavailability. This distinction is critical, and the failure to understand it is responsible for more relationship damage than almost any other single misunderstanding. Emotional unavailability is a defense. It is a closed door with a person huddled behind it, hoping no one knocks too hard. Psychological freedom is an open field. It is a person who has done enough internal work that they genuinely do not require any particular outcome from any particular relationship to maintain their sense of self. Those two things look similar from the outside. Both involve a certain coolness, a certain non-desperation, a certain quality of not chasing, but they feel entirely different to the person in proximity to them. The emotionally unavailable person creates tension because they are withholding. The psychologically free person creates fascination because they are not withholding anything. They simply have a gravitational center that does not shift based on whether someone stays or leaves. And the avoidant, whose entire life has been organized around maintaining a false version of that kind of centeredness, recognizes the real version immediately. It unsettles them in a way they cannot explain. It pulls at something underneath their carefully constructed self-sufficiency. It makes them question, for perhaps the first time, whether what they have been calling independence was actually just isolation wearing a confident mask. The ego, in psychological terms, is not arrogance. The ego is the story the mind tells about who we are and what we deserve. The avoidance ego has been telling a very specific story for a very long time. That story says, I am someone who does not need. I am someone who does not bend. I am someone who chooses solitude not because I am afraid of connection, but because I have simply evolved beyond the messiness of needing another person. That story, believed completely, creates a particular kind of identity, one that is internally consistent, emotionally stable in the short term, and utterly incompatible with genuine intimacy. And when someone enters the avoidance life who sees through that story, not because they confront it directly, but because they model a completely different one, the avoidance ego experiences something it is entirely unprepared for. It experiences being outgrown, not criticized, not attacked, outgrown. And being outgrown by someone you quietly assessed as less than you is one of the most psychologically destabilizing experiences the human ego can undergo. Obsession, in the context of the avoidant, does not begin with attraction. That is another thing mainstream relationship content consistently gets wrong. Obsession begins with a rupture in the internal narrative. When the avoidant has a fixed story about who you are, someone who needs them, someone who orbits them, someone whose emotional temperature is determined by their proximity, and you suddenly stop fitting that story, the mind cannot simply update its file and move on. The mind becomes preoccupied. It returns to you the way a tongue returns to a missing tooth, not because you are performing something magnetic, but because you have become a psychological anomaly. A person who no longer confirms what the avoidant's entire relational framework predicted you would confirm, and the human mind, at its deepest operational level, is a prediction machine. It is disturbed, genuinely, neurologically disturbed, by things it cannot predict. It allocates enormous cognitive and emotional resources to understanding what it failed to anticipate. That allocation of resources is, in ordinary language, what people call not being able to stop thinking about someone. The secret that nobody tells you, the one buried under layers of attachment theory and relationship advice and the endless cycle of pursue and withdraw dynamics, is that the avoidant does not fall in love the way other people do. They do not fall in love through accumulation of good moments, through consistent warmth, through the gradual building of trust in the conventional sense. They fall, and when they fall, it is often sudden, total, and terrifying to them, through the experience of encountering someone whose existence makes their defensive architecture feel like a prison rather than a home. Something shifts. Something in the avoidant's internal world recognizes, below the level of conscious thought, that the walls they built to protect themselves are now the very thing separating them from something they genuinely want. And that recognition, when it arrives, does not feel like attraction. It feels like emergency. Emergency is not a word most people associate with falling in love. But for the avoidant, that is precisely what genuine attraction feels like. Not the warm, gradual opening that secure attachment literature describes, but something closer to an alarm going off in a building they thought was permanently sealed. The avoidant does not experience the early stages of real attraction as excitement. They experience it as threat assessment. They begin watching you more carefully. They begin noticing details about you they previously dismissed. They begin, almost involuntarily, constructing a more complex internal portrait of who you are, because the simple portrait they had, the one that kept them comfortable and in control, no longer accounts for everything they are observing. And that process of reconstruction, that internal scrambling to recategorize someone who refuses to stay categorized, is the beginning of something the avoidant will not name for a very long time. But it is there, it is running, and it is changing things underneath the surface in ways that will eventually become impossible to ignore. Beneath every avoidance emotional architecture, there is a question they have never been able to answer. The question is not, do I deserve love? That framing is too conscious, too clean. The real question, operating at the level of the nervous system rather than the intellect, is closer to this. Is it possible to be fully known and still chosen? Every avoidant relationship dynamic, every withdrawal, every moment of inexplicable coldness after warmth, every disappearance after depth, all of it is, at its root, an unconscious experiment designed to answer that question without the risk of actually asking it. The avoidant creates distance not because they want distance, but because distance is the only controlled environment in which they can observe whether someone will stay. They push and they watch. They cool and they watch. They disappear and they watch. And what they are watching for, what they have always been watching for, is evidence that someone's regard for them is not contingent on their performance of availability. But here is the devastating irony at the center of the entire dynamic. The very behavior they use to test for unconditional regard is the behavior most likely to drive away the people capable of offering it. The avoidance survival strategy is simultaneously their greatest self-sabotage, and most of them live their entire lives without ever seeing this clearly enough to change it. Genuine self-respect is the only force powerful enough to interrupt that cycle, and not self-respect as a concept, not self-respect as something you tell yourself in the mirror, but self-respect as a lived, embodied, visible reality that other people can feel in proximity to you. When a person carries genuine self-respect, they do not interpret the avoidance withdrawal as information about their own worth. They interpret it correctly, as information about the avoidant's current capacity. That reinterpretation is not a coping mechanism. It is not a strategy designed to seem unbothered. It is the natural result of having done enough internal work that your sense of value is no longer sourced from external confirmation. And the avoidant, who is exquisitely sensitive to the difference between performed confidence and real confidence because they have spent years performing their own version of it, feels that difference in every interaction. Real self-respect does not announce itself. It simply occupies space in a way that makes everyone in the room unconsciously recalibrate. Recalibration is what the avoidant is actually doing when they seem to suddenly become more interested after you have stopped pursuing them. Most people interpret this shift through the lens of game playing, as though the avoidant is strategically waiting for the other person to give up before swooping in to reclaim the upper hand. Sometimes that is true, but far more often, what is actually happening is an involuntary psychological recalibration triggered by the removal of the dynamic they were using to define the relationship. When you were pursuing, the avoidance nervous system had a clear role: be pursued. When you stop, that role disappears. And a person without a clear role in a relationship they have been unconsciously defining through their own withdrawal suddenly has to confront a deeply uncomfortable question, not why did they stop, but who am I in this dynamic if I am no longer the one being sought? That question, for an identity built almost entirely on the myth of self-sufficiency, is far more destabilizing than it appears. It forces a confrontation with something the avoidant has been carefully avoiding for years: the possibility that they wanted to be wanted and that the loss of being wanted feels remarkably close to loss itself. Loss, for the avoidant, carries a particular psychological signature that most people around them never get to witness, because the avoidant does not process loss the way secure individuals do, openly, with grief expressed outward, with the kind of vulnerability that invites support. The avoidant processes loss inward, in private, often without even fully acknowledging to themselves that loss is what they are feeling. What surfaces instead are behaviors: a sudden interest in productivity, an unusual preoccupation with new projects, a social activity that seems slightly too enthusiastic to be genuine. These are not signs that the avoidant has moved on. These are the signs that the avoidant is using every available distraction to avoid sitting with a feeling they do not have the emotional vocabulary to process. Underneath all of it, something is happening that they would never admit. They are missing you, not the idea of you, not the convenience of you, but the specific, irreplaceable texture of your presence in their life. And that missing, when it becomes undeniable even to them, is the moment that changes everything. The transformation that happens inside an avoidant when they are confronted with genuine loss is not the soft, cinematic awakening that most people hope for. It is more disorienting than that. It is more disturbing than that, because the avoidant's entire psychological identity is built on the premise that they do not truly need anyone, and genuine loss, the kind that persists past the initial distraction phase, presents direct evidence that contradicts that premise at a fundamental level. The mind cannot hold two contradictory core beliefs simultaneously. Something has to give. And when what gives is the belief in total self-sufficiency, what rushes in to fill that space is not just longing. What rushes in is a terrifying clarity about how much of their life they have spent protecting themselves from the very thing they actually wanted. That clarity does not feel like liberation, at least not at first. It feels like grief for years spent hiding. It feels like the specific, quiet devastation of realizing the armor you wore to survive was also what prevented you from living. People who study human behavior will tell you that obsession forms when the brain's reward system is unpredictably activated. The same neurological principle that makes variable reward schedules more addictive than consistent ones. That is true, and it is relevant. But what they rarely discuss is the specific mechanism through which a psychologically grounded, genuinely self-possessed person creates that neurological effect without doing anything manipulative. They create it simply by being real, by having genuine depth that cannot be exhausted in a single conversation, by having a life that has genuine meaning independent of the relationship, by responding to the avoidance tests not with anxiety or anger, but with a calm that suggests there are interior resources the avoidant has not yet accessed and may never fully access. That mystery, the mystery of a person who is fully present but somehow never fully available to be reduced to a simple story, is more neurologically activating than any deliberate push-pull strategy ever designed. Because it is not a strategy, it is a character. And character, unlike strategy, cannot be decoded and dismissed. It can only be returned to again and again in the hope of understanding something that keeps revealing new depth. New depth is what the avoidant craves without knowing they crave it. Their entire relational history has been with people they could eventually figure out. People whose need made them predictable. People whose pursuit made them knowable. People who eventually revealed the full map of themselves in their desperation to be chosen. The avoidant, having seen the full map, loses interest, not because they are malicious,